They see only what is immediately visible to the eye. Everything we get outside of the free gifts of nature must in some way be paid for. Economics is haunted by more fallacies than any other study known to man. To see the problem as a whole and not in fragments, that is the goal of economic science. We cannot distribute more wealth than is created. We cannot, in the long run, pay labour as a whole more than it produces. What is saved on consumers' goods is spent on capital goods. The borrowing must someday be repaid. The government cannot keep piling up debt indefinitely, for if it tries, it will someday become bankrupt. Deficit spending, once embarked upon, creates powerful vested interests which demand its continuance under all conditions. Almost the whole wealth of the modern world, nearly everything that distinguishes it from the pre-industrial world of the 17th century, consists of its accumulated capital. What is harmful or disastrous to an individual must be equally harmful or disastrous to the collection of individuals that make up a nation. There is a real promise that public policy may be reversed before the damage from existing measures and trends has become irreparable. It is true that the United States has been losing its world economic leadership in recent years, but because of our own anti-capitalist governmental policies, not because of economic maturity. The indignation shown by many people today at the mention of the very word profits indicates how little understanding there is of the vital function that profits play in our economy. If money is kept either in savings banks or commercial banks, as we have already seen, the banks are eager to lend and invest it. They cannot afford to have idle funds. There is no more certain way to deter employment than to harass and penalize employers. There is no more certain way to keep wages low than to destroy every incentive to invest in new and more efficient machines and equipment. We may take as the outstanding example inflation. This is not only a policy imposed for its own sake, but an inevitable result of most of the other interventionist policies. It stands today as the universal symbol of government intervention everywhere. Fallacies, when they have reached the popular stage, become anonymous anyway. The subtleties or obscurities to be found in the authors most responsible for propagating them are washed off. A doctrine becomes simplified. The sophism that may have been buried in a network of qualifications, ambiguities, or mathematical equations stands clear. If money that would previously have been used for savings were thrown into the purchase of consumers' goods, it would not increase employment, but merely lead to an increase in the price of consumption goods and to a decrease in the price of capital goods. More and more people are becoming aware that government has nothing to give them without first taking it away from somebody else or from themselves. Increased handouts to selected groups mean merely increased taxes or increased deficits and increased inflation. And inflation, in the end, misdirects and disorganizes production. More than 40 years after the publication of John Maynard Keynes' General Theory, and more than 20 years after that book has been thoroughly discredited by analysis and experience, a great number of our politicians are still unceasingly recommending more deficit spending in order to cure or reduce existing unemployment. An appalling irony is that they are making these recommendations when the federal government has already been running a deficit for 41 out of the last 48 years, and when that deficit has been reaching dimensions of $50 billion a year. One of the worst results of the retention of the Keynesian myths is that it not only promotes greater and greater inflation, but that it systematically diverts attention from the real causes of our unemployment, such as excessive union wage rates, minimum wage laws, excessive and prolonged unemployment insurance, and over-generous relief payments. But the inflation, though in part often deliberate, is today mainly the consequence of other government economic interventions. It is the consequence, in brief, of the redistributive state of all the policies of expropriating money from Peter in order to lavish it on Paul. Inflation acts to determine the individual and business policies we are all forced to follow. It discourages all prudence and thrift. It encourages squandering, gambling, reckless waste of all kinds. It often makes it more profitable to speculate than to produce. It tears apart the whole fabric of stable economic relationships. Its inexcusable injustices drive men toward desperate remedies. It plants the seeds of fascism and communism. It leads men to demand totalitarian controls. It ends invariably in bitter disillusion and collapse. This capital is made up in part of many things that might better be called consumers' durable goods: automobiles, refrigerators, furniture, schools, colleges, churches, libraries, hospitals, and above all, private homes. Never in the history of the world has there been enough of these. Even if there were enough homes from a purely numerical point of view, qualitative improvements are possible and desirable without definite limit in all but the very best houses. In brief, the main problem we face today is not economic but political. Sound economists are in substantial agreement concerning what ought to be done. Particularly, all government attempts to redistribute wealth and income tend to smother productive incentives and lead toward general impoverishment. It is the proper sphere of government to create and enforce a framework of law that prohibits force and fraud, but it must refrain from specific economic interventions. Government's main economic function is to encourage and preserve a free market. When Alexander the Great visited the philosopher Diogenes and asked whether he could do anything for him, Diogenes is said to have replied, quote, "Yes, stand a little less between me and the sun," end quote. It is what every citizen is entitled to ask of his government. From time immemorial, proverbial wisdom has taught the virtues of saving and warned against the consequences of prodigality and waste. This proverbial wisdom has reflected the common ethical as well as the merely prudential judgments of mankind, but there have always been squanderers, and there have apparently always been theorists to rationalize their squandering. The classical economists, refuting the fallacies of their own day, showed that the saving policy that was in the best interest of the individual was also in the best interest of the nation. They showed that the rational saver, in making provision for his own future, was not hurting but helping the whole community. Cheap money policies, in short, eventually bring about far more violent oscillations in business than those they are designed to remedy or prevent. If no effort is made to tamper with money rates through inflationary governmental policies, increased savings create their own demand by lowering interest rates in a natural manner. The greater supply of savings seeking investment forces savers to accept lower rates. But lower rates also mean that more enterprises can afford to borrow because their prospective profit on the new machines or plants they buy with the proceeds seems likely to exceed what they have to pay from the borrowed funds. There will not be a quote-unquote surplus of capital until the most backward country is as well equipped technologically as the most advanced, until the most inefficient factory in America is brought abreast of the factory with the latest and most elaborate equipment, and until the most modern tools of production have reached a point where human ingenuity is at a dead end and can improve them no further. As long as any of these conditions remain unfulfilled, there will be indefinite room for more capital. There is no assignable limit to the amount of new capital that can be absorbed. The steady reduction of unit costs of production by the addition of new capital does either one of two things or both. It reduces the costs of goods to consumers, and it increases the wages of the labor that uses the new machines, because it increases the productive power of that labor. Thus, a new machine benefits both the people who work on it directly and the great body of consumers. In the case of consumers, we may say either that it supplies them with more and better goods for the same money, or what is the same thing, that it increases their real incomes. In the case of the workers who use the new machines, it increases their real wages in a double way by increasing their money wages as well. A typical illustration is the automobile business. The American automobile industry pays the highest wages in the world, and among the very highest even in America. Yet American motor car makers can undersell the rest of the world because their unit cost is lower. And the secret is that the capital used in making American automobiles is greater per worker and per car than anywhere else in the world. The argument overlooks the marginal saver, and even, indeed, the great majority of savers. The effect of keeping interest rates artificially low, in fact, is eventually the same as that of keeping any other price below the natural market. It increases demand and reduces supply. It increases the demand for capital and reduces the supply of real capital. It brings about a scarcity. It creates economic distortions. It is true, no doubt, that an artificial reduction in the interest rate encourages increased borrowing. It tends, in fact, to encourage highly speculative ventures that cannot continue except under the artificial conditions that gave them birth. On the supply side, the artificial reduction of interest rates discourages normal thrift and saving. It brings about a comparative shortage of real capital. The money rate can, indeed, be kept artificially low only by continuous new injections of currency or bank credit in place of real savings. This can create the illusion of more capital, just as the addition of water can create the illusion of more milk. But it is a policy of continuous inflation. It is obviously a process involving cumulative danger. The money rate will rise and a crisis will develop if the inflation is reversed or merely brought to a halt, or even continued at a diminished rate. Is a psychopathic fear of excessive interest rates. It is argued that if interest rates are too high, it will not be profitable for industry to borrow and invest in new plants and machines. This argument has been so effective that governments everywhere in recent decades have pursued artificial, quote-unquote, cheap money policies, but the argument in its concern with increasing the demand for capital overlooks the effect of these policies on the supply of capital. It is one more example of the fallacy of looking at the effects of a policy only on one group and forgetting the effects on another. If interest rates are artificially kept too low in relation to risks, funds will neither be saved nor lent. The cheap money proponents believe that saving goes on automatically regardless of the interest rate because the stated rich have nothing else that they can do with their money. They do not stop to tell us at precisely what personal income level a man saves a fixed minimum amount regardless of the rate of interest or the risk at which he can lend it. The fact is that, though the volume of saving of the very rich is doubtless affected much less proportionally than that of the moderately well-off by changes in the interest rate, particularly everyone's savings is affected in some degree. To argue on the basis of an extreme example that the volume of real savings would not be reduced by a substantial reduction in the interest rate is like arguing that the total production of sugar would not be reduced by a substantial fall of its price because the efficient, low-cost producers would still raise as much as before. In sum, so far as the politicians are concerned, the lesson that this book tried to instill more than 30 years ago does not seem to have been learned anywhere. If we go through the chapters of this book, Seriatim, we find particularly no form of government intervention deprecated in the first edition that is not still being pursued, usually with increased obstinacy. Governments everywhere are still trying to cure by public works the unemployment brought about by their own policies. They are imposing heavier and more expropriatory taxes than ever. They still recommend credit expansion. Most of them still make full employment their overriding goal. They continue to impose import quotas and protective tariffs. They try to increase exports by depreciating their currencies even further. Farmers are still striking for parity prices. Governments still provide special encouragements to unprofitable industries. They still make efforts to stabilize special commodity prices. Governments pushing up commodity prices by inflating their currencies continue to blame the higher prices on private producers, sellers and profiteers. They impose price ceilings on oil and natural gas to discourage new exploration, precisely when it is in most need of encouragement, or resort to general price and wage fixing or monitoring. They continue rent control in the face of the obvious devastation it has caused. They not only retain minimum wage laws, but keep increasing their level in face of the chronic unemployment they so clearly bring about. They continue to pass laws granting special privileges and immunities to labour unions, to oblige workers to become members, to tolerate mass picketing and other forms of coercion, and to compel employers to bargain collectively in good faith with such unions, i.e., to make at least some concessions to their demands. The intention of all these measures is to help labour, but the result is once more to create and prolong unemployment and to lower total wage payments compared with what they might have been. Most politicians continue to ignore the necessity of profits, to overestimate their average or total net amount, to denounce unusual profits anywhere, to tax them excessively, and sometimes even to deplore the very existence of profits. It is clear, in any case, that any individual placing venture capital runs a risk not only of earning no return, but of losing his whole principal. In the past, it has been the lure of high profits in special firms or industries that has led him to take that great risk. But if profits are limited to a maximum of say 10% or some similar figure, while the risk of losing one's entire capital still exists, what is likely to be the effect on the profit incentive and hence on employment and production? The wartime excess profits tax has already shown us what such a limit can do, even for a short period, in undermining efficiency. Yet governmental policy almost everywhere today tends to assume that production will go on automatically, no matter what is done to discourage it. One of the greatest dangers to production today comes from government price fixing policies. Not only do these policies put one item after another out of production by leaving no incentive to make it, but their long-run effect is to prevent a balance of production in accordance with the actual demands of consumers. If the economy were free, demand would act so that some branches of production would make what government officials would undoubtedly regard as excessive or unreasonable profits, but that very fact would not only cause every firm in that line to expand its production to the utmost and to reinvest its profits in more machinery and more employment, it would also attract new investors and producers from everywhere until production in that line was great enough to meet demand, and the profits in it again fell to the general average level. In a free economy in which wages, costs, and prices are left to the free play of the competitive market, the prospect of profits decides what articles will be made and in what quantities, and what articles will not be made at all. If there is no profit in making an article, it is a sign that the labour and capital devoted to its production are misdirected. The value of the resources that must be used up in making the article is greater than the value of the article itself. One function of profits, in brief, is to guide and channel the factors of production so as to appropriation the relative output of thousands of different commodities in accordance with demand. No bureaucrat, no matter how brilliant, can solve this problem arbitrarily. Free prices and free profits will maximize the production and relieve shortages quicker than any other system. Arbitrarily fixed prices and arbitrarily limited profits can only prolong shortages and reduce production and employment. This brings us to the general meaning and effect of economic equilibrium. Equilibrium wages and prices are the wages and prices that equalize supply and demand. If either through government or private coercion, an attempt is made to lift prices above their equilibrium level, demand is reduced, and therefore production is reduced. If an attempt is made to push prices below their equilibrium level, the consequent reduction or wiping out of profits will mean a falling off of supply or new production. Therefore, an attempt to force prices either above or below their equilibrium levels, which are the levels toward which a free market constantly tends to bring them, will act to reduce the volume of employment and production below what it would otherwise have been, to return, then, to the doctrine that labour must get, in quote unquote, enough to buy back the product, the national product, it should be obvious, is neither created nor bought by manufacturing labour alone. It is bought by everyone, by white-collar workers, professional men, farmers, employers, big and little, investors, grocers, butchers, owners of small drugstores and gasoline stations, by everybody, in short, who contributes toward making the product. As to the prices, wages and profit should determine the distribution of that product. The best prices are not the highest prices, but the prices that encourage the largest volume of production and the largest volume of sales. The best wage rates for labour are not the highest wage rates, but the wage rates that permit full production, full employment, and the largest sustained payrolls. The best profits, from the standpoint not only of industry but of labour, are not the lowest profits, but the profits that encourage most people to become employers or to provide more employment than before. If we try to run the economy for the benefit of a single group or class, we shall injure or destroy all groups, including the members of the very class for whose benefit we have been trying to run it. We must run the economy for everybody.